So arguably, Lenin has the Soviet Union on a pretty good path, but he dies in 1924. So just remember from the previous video, the new economic policy was a way to sort of, I guess, lessen the shock of just completely indoctrinating the Soviet Union into a communist economy. A lot of the peasants were, brand new to actually owning land. Forced quotas was something that wasn't working, was resulting in famine, crop failures. So, the new economic plan actually was a good way to sort of take a step back from full-on communism. Um, but Lenin dies, and since we no longer have a dynastic family in power anymore, there is a question as to who will replace him. So um, it comes between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. We most likely remember Trotsky as the leader of the Red Army, sort of the next person behind Lenin is basically the most important person contributing to the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. So how come Stalin, who was arguably the more obscure character, ultimately took control of the Soviet Union? One of the reasons why that was because a lot of people thought that he had a little bit more of a pragmatic approach towards incorporating communism into Russia. He made the argument that socialism could be achieved in one country. All right, this is different from Lenin, if you recall, because Lenin, like Marx, believed that communism was meant to be an international movement. Now, Stalin's idea of socialism in one country was appealing to a lot of people because the idea was that Russia had to be very strong internally. It needed to sort of, it shouldn't make the move towards international communism until it actually achieved communism by itself. Also, the idea behind socialism in one country was that Russia could establish a socialist economy without seeking aid from outside, particularly because Western countries were sort of in fear of the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution. So Leon Trotsky, however, was much more Marxist in his approach. He believed that this world communist revolution needed to continue. He believed that the worldwide communist revolution would be permanent in a sense. Trotsky basically didn't think that Russia could build socialism at home. It needed to be this international movement. So people in the Communist Party started to think that Trotsky's worldwide approach was too idealistic. And so people started to get more attracted to Stalin because they think, he's keeping it within the country. It's sort of a more realistic goal. And so ultimately why Stalin rises to power is because Stalin gains the favor of his party. If you're in a communist government with one party in control, once you secure the favor of your party, then everything else sort of falls into place. So effectively, Stalin gained control by 1927, but by 1929 he had total control. So how was he actually able to go from essentially being in control of the Soviet Union to be totally in control? Well, again, the effective control was gained by winning the influence of the party, which again is key when you are in a one-party state. Also, he defeats Trotsky and any other people that stand in his way, anyone who doesn't really want to toe the Communist Party line, the radicals, so to speak, because again, Stalin was a little bit more of a realistic communist. He defeats these people, and also, to establish complete control, he basically gets rid of Trotsky. Trotsky ends up getting exiled to Mexico, and is eventually assassinated there by Stalin's agents. So ultimately, to gain complete control, you need to actually eliminate your competition, I guess in the literal sense, by not only ridding Russia of Stalin's competitor, he actually had him killed, so ultimately, obviously, there's absolutely no challenge to his authority anymore. So how did Stalin rule the Soviet Union? Well, first off, again, he is attempting to do everything that he can to establish himself as the only legitimate leader of the Soviet Union, getting rid of any previous influence, people that were still looking towards maybe a more idealistic Marxist approach like Lenin. So the Politburo, the Soviet political body, still had a bunch of people that were serving the Politburo under Lenin's time, And so the first thing that Stalin does is he basically gets rid of all the people in the Politburo that were left over from when Lenin was in control. So basically this means that Stalin is in absolute control. Any sort of opposition that could exist to Stalin's policies, either people that were leaning more towards Lenin's direction, the much more kind of literal Marxist interpretation, those people are going to get purged, so to speak. And then people that are more conservative as well are also going to no longer have an influence over the government. So Stalin's idea was to get rid of anyone who deviated from the party line, right? His ideas, only this communism from within Russia was something that he would accept within the government. Otherwise, you would be out. And then he introduces these controversial 5-year plans, which really sort of are the stamp that is left on Stalin's rule of Russia. His belief was that communism had to be achieved from a top-down approach, right? It actually had to be instituted from the state rather than from the proletariat itself. Also, it's important to realize that when Stalin institutes the 5-year plans, this effectively ends the national economic policy that we talked about last time. So no longer is there going to be sort of a remnant of capitalism in the economy. No longer are peasants going to be able to sell their surplus products. All right, the 5-year plan is an absolute control over all elements of the economy. So what are its goals? Okay, Stalin is incredibly concerned with where Russia is industrially. It is now the late 1920s, and Russia is still very far behind Western countries. Stalin's argument is that Russia is about 50 or 100 years behind advanced countries, and he argues that they must make good this distance in 10 years, either that or we shall go under. Okay, so basically the idea behind the 5-year plans was to catch Russia up industrially as quickly as possible. So his goals were very high, right? He wants to increase industrial output by 250%, steel output by 300%, and agriculture by 150%. The way that he is going to accomplish this increase in agricultural production was to collectivize farming, right? So basically the idea was that farmers were to give up all of their private plots of land and farm together. Again, think about how this would be opposed by a lot of farmers who had only recently gained private property ownership of land during the Bolshevik Revolution. This was a very quick turnover. There was basically a 10-year period where these former peasants could own land, and suddenly the state was telling them that they had to, again, surrender any sense of private ownership and farm together. Again, the idea was to catch up with the West as quickly as possible. So in terms of industrial production, the 5-year plans actually did meet a lot of success. In fact, in certain areas, they actually exceeded their quotas. So, for example, with steel production, it went up 400%, and the USSR ends up being the second largest steel producer in all of Europe. And oil production also goes up by 300%, and Russia urbanizes very rapidly. All right, in this 5-year period, 25 million people moved to cities in Russia. Okay, but what's the problem? Even though the production rises significantly, the goods that are being produced are not very high in quality because they're being produced so quickly. The quotas are set so high that, these goods are basically substandard. And it also means because people are moving so quickly to the cities, the standards of living are also not going up. So, even though the production quotas are met, people in Russia are not living any better than they had prior to the 5-year plans. And really, the problem with the 5-year plans was what happens to agriculture. Okay, again, the collectivization of agriculture was meant to rid any sort of notion of private property from the peasant class. It was the most costly element of the 5-year plans. The idea was not only to take away private property ownership, but also try to prevent the peasants from having any sort of independence, right? The idea was to take away their land, was to bring them under absolute control of the communist state. So what the government really wants to do is to get more people out of farming and get them into industrial production. As time goes on, the USSR is investing more in mechanization of farming, right? Actually using machines to do the hard work, and the idea was to free people up to work in industrial production. So the government starts to control production, and this is its way of extending socialism into the countryside. So collectivization in itself was consolidating all these individual peasant farms into very large state-controlled enterprises. All right, farmers now got paid according to the amount of work that they did, and and basically a certain portion of their harvest was actually directly taken by the governments. All right, the state, what it wanted to do was make sure it had enough grain to feed urban workers. It really wasn't concerned with how well fed the peasants were. Okay, collective farmers actually had to meet the quotas that the government set for them for grain before they could even feed themselves. So what this is going to do pretty clearly is make the peasants hungry, but ultimately what the state is more concerned with is feeding the urban workers. So in some ways, collectivization actually was a sort of purposeful way for the government to sort of purge the peasant classes. All right, so not surprisingly, farmers really don't like collectivization. They had only just gotten private land ownership. Like I said earlier, it was only under Lenin that land was taken from the wealthier classes and redistributed. Now suddenly the peasants are faced with giving it back up. It's similar to the Mears collective farms that we saw around the turn of the century, or actually more like around the Emancipation Act in 1860, the Mears collective farms. Basically, peasants weren't able to actually have any sort of surplus. Also, Stalin wants to get rid of the wealthiest peasant class, right? They are called the kulaks, the better off peasants, and they are the ones who resist collectivization the most because they stand to lose the most. They are the ones who actually own more property, or actually they were able to profit. They very much enjoyed the new economic policy, but Stalin knows that because the kulaks stand to lose the most, that they are most likely going to be the people who resist collectivization more than anybody else. They stand to engage in uprisings and things like that. And so Stalin actually calls to liquidate the kulaks as a class. In other words, get rid of them, kill them. Kulaks actually were not allowed to join collective farms, so once their land was taken away from them, they were homeless, they had absolutely no food, so kulaks basically either starved to death, or they were deported to places like Siberia to work in forced labor camps. This is some former kulaks working in forced labor camps here. As a result of collectivization, about 10 million people died in the USSR, and out of that, 7 million of them were specifically from the Ukraine, because in the Ukraine region, the government set really high quotas, and Ukrainians started to starve, but the government actually did not lift these quotas even then. In a lot of ways, this was, again, the USSR's way of suppressing this part of the population, realized that the Ukrainians had nationalist sentiment outside of the USSR. They didn't necessarily feel like they were part of this new communist Russia. And so basically Russia forced them to farm as much as they could for the state, did not allow them to keep or eat any of the things that they were producing, and it ultimately killed them. So it was a way for the USSR to both feed the urban workers and get rid of a potential opposing population at the same time. A couple other things about collectivization before we end up this video. Collectivization is not successful in increasing agricultural output. In fact, they were not producing any more than they did before World War I. You're going to see, though, that it does successfully relocate peasants, so if anything, it's successful in keeping peasants under control. By 1933, 60% of peasant families were on collective farms, and by 1938, 93% of peasant families were on collective farms, so that's a huge difference. Now, this truly is totalitarianism, because now all the peasants are effectively controlled by the state. So this means that they're not a threat to the communist government anymore. And also, it's successful in terms of industrial population. Even though the industrial output does not increase, there is still enough food to feed urban workers. Basically, the government is able to sort of make up for the lack of agricultural output by the fact that so many peasants, again, about 10 million of them, die in this 5-year plan process. So we'll pick up in the next video talking about government, propaganda, and the status of women.